Hello everyone, and thanks very much for coming to our book launch of Our Trade Unions, What Comes Next After the Summer of 22, written by Nigel Flanagan. We've got Nigel with us here tonight. And so I'll introduce him in a wee second. Just before we do, the format for tonight is Nigel's going to speak to us for about 5-10 minutes, and then we'll move on to some questions from everyone before he'll sum up at the end. So without further ado, Nigel Flanagan is a long-time trade union organiser who has taken on many roles and was recently involved in organising the How We Fight, How We Win rank and file organising conference. He's involved in the mass rally supporting Coventry Amazon strikers on the 5th of August, which I'm sure we'll talk about a little bit later on. And he is, of course, the author of Our Trade Unions, What Comes Next After the Summer of 22, which we'll be discussing today. Nigel, do you want to go ahead?
Thank you, Sophie, and it's nice to see everybody here. Some faces I know, a lot of people I don't. But the first thing I want to do is thank Counterfire for inviting me to come and talk about the book. And I'll tell you a little bit about myself and a little bit about the book, and then hopefully, you know, there'll be some debate or some contributions about what I've actually said. The book is published by Manifesto Press, by the way, so you can go online and order the book either to download or as a hard copy, and it's now in its 2nd edition. I have to say that I started writing it before all the national ballots and the upsurge of strikes and trade union militancy came back into the headlines. I was actually writing it provoked by the P&O Ferries disaster, really, I think, from a trade union point of view, where 800 workers were sacked with very little in terms of response from the trade union movement that could do anything to stop that from happening. But obviously it became a bit of a moving piece, because every day I wrote something, a strike broke out or a ballot broke out or something happened. So it became quite a sort of a race against time in many ways. For those of you who don't know me though, I'm a long-standing trade union activist for about 20 years, a lay activist inside Unison, was eventually dismissed for trade union activities under the Labour government over a dispute to try and prevent the transfer of council housing into the private sector. I was subsequently employed by Unison as an organiser, but I suppose really the bulk of the work that has informed my book is I spent 7 years working for a global trade union on organising projects, mainly in Africa and in many different parts of the world: Palestine, Russia, Turkey, India, Nepal, as well as in Chile and in then something like 20 odd different African countries alongside trade unions. And that was one of the pieces of my life that was at the front of what I wanted to write about. So basically the book is about this. The trade union movement is in a lot of trouble. And although that the upsurge this summer has been really exciting, and I know all of us here will have been inspired by some of the things that have happened and thought we might never see it again, and we welcome it and we're very happy to be involved in it, and we really love the idea that what this has done has put the idea of unions back in the minds of many, many workers. But behind the scenes, the long-term decline of trade unionism in Britain has resulted in a kind of landscape, if you like, of absolute devastation. So in terms of membership, trade union density is now down below 23% nationally in Britain, which is more than half of what it was in 1979 at one of its peaks. But it's not just that simple collapse in numbers. It's in the areas of the economy and in the demographics of where the membership is that mean that the trade union movement could end up in 10, 20 years' time be significantly smaller even than it is now. And some of the figures that I quote in the book, all the figures I get from in the book are from the government's employment workplace survey which is produced by civil servants and relied on by academics and trade unions to give evidence and information on the strength and power and density of trade unions. But in simple ways, the most horrible things that come out of that is that in the private sector, trade union density is below 17% and falling. In some areas of the economy, such as banking, IT, and service sectors, the areas that still represent a little bit of growth, the density is between 12 and 8%. In certain parts of retail and service industries to do with accommodation, it is at 3%. Amongst the workforce, of those workers who are aged 19 and under, only 1.8% of them are members of a trade union. Only 3.7% of trade union members are aged 24 or under. So what we appear to be having is a cliff top effect coming to us, where the number of members of trade unions, 75% of trade union members are over the age of 35. When they are dragooned into retirement or leave through ill health or whatever, at the moment, it doesn't look like we're replacing them with young workers. So that depressing picture has been a constant since the 1940s. What I criticise quite heavily is the two trade union responses to that. The first response was to try and shift the whole movement into servicing. In order to attract workers, we have to abandon the militancy and the radical strike tactics of the 1960s and 1970s, and we offer services to workers in order to appeal to them almost as consumers. And then that's the way forward. That's the way it has to work. The militancy was not popular. It didn't get us anywhere, and therefore we can attract workers into trade unions, modern workers, by offering them discounts, services, legal representation, and all the rest of it. That has demonstrably failed at every level. It didn't work even in the beginning. There was no surge of people back into trade unions as a result of that activity. The second element that I've criticised, and I criticise strongly, and as somebody who's been involved in it directly, is the use of professional organising schools, professional organising gurus, taking the lessons or the apparent lessons from the North American trade union movement, that what we need to do is employ and deploy professional organisers across sectors where we can't organise and get them to build the trade union movement. Now, to many people, it still seems like a new and fresh idea, but actually the trade union movement have been flogging this direction since the mid-1990s. And again, demonstrably, it has made no difference at all to the downward graph of trade union membership, and especially amongst young workers. In fact, one of the figures that's quite astonishing, which people are not very happy about, but it's there in the figures submitted to the certification officer by trade unions, is that Unite itself, since its formation in the 1990s, has lost 811,000 members. And that's not an attack on Unite, but that is a significant loss to the working class movement as a whole. So the depressing sort of element of my book really is to say these initiatives, these drives, these officer-led or bureaucracy-led or top-down strategies of trying to revive the trade union movement are all failing and will always fail. And what I argue is two things. First of all, the significant and most important factor in trade union growth and trade union power is a strong political rank and file movement. And any strategy that doesn't have that at the heart of it is not going to organise workers back into the trade union movement. And in fact, the problem being that so many elements of the trade union organisations are opposed to anything that empowers a rank and file renaissance inside the trade unions, means that the professional organisers and the service strategies have still got that residual appeal inside the trade union movement among the leadership. So that lack of a rank and file movement is incredibly, obviously a weakness in what happens next. And therefore, the primary objective of all trade union activists is to rebuild and revive that rank and file power. And I talk a lot in the book about how that might be done. And Counterfire has been very actively involved in all the politics of trying to rebuild the rank and file movement. But the other element, which I think is really important, and this does reflect my own experience, and I make no apologies for throwing this into the book, is that the obvious examples for trade union growth exist in countries around the world and in movements around the world that are in the so-called global south. That if we want to look for inspiration in how trade union movements can develop and grow with rank and file power and with much more obvious and clear political objectives in line, we should be looking at some of the countries in the global south, such as Kenya, which is an example I use, in Morocco is an example I use, but there are many others. But in particular, in India, of course, the largest general strike in history, involving over 250 million workers, took place in 2021. And it would seem obvious to me that there is a problem inside the trade union movement in the UK if we are not actively trying to learn some lessons and take some inspiration from these many, many examples of growth and trade union militancy that exist around the world. And the last thing I'll say on this is that particularly now, these examples 40 or 50 years ago may well have appeared to have been somewhat remote or disconnected from the UK movement. But these days they're not. The global economy is the global economy. Many companies now are far more powerful than national governments. And some of these companies that we're fighting, and the classic example is Amazon. Amazon has the same operations all over the world, the same policy, the same strategy, the same directive, the same struggle. And therefore, learning from how we organize in Amazon should not consist of learning just from North America, where to all intents and purposes we're largely failing, but looking at how trade union organizations are managing to organize in these sectors with young workers in many of the areas of their economies that we fail to do so in ours. So I want to finish, sorry to go on for so long, Sophie, but you know, my book is not some kind of blueprint for the future of trade unions. I hope my book is a cry for let's start looking at this again. Let's recognize the reality. Let's look at rank and file politics as a solution to the trade union disintegration that's taking place around us. And then let's come up with a strategy that also takes inspiration from comrades, brothers and sisters in the rest of the world, and not just in those parts of the economy that seem to exist in a kind of white European or North American world. That is my intention in writing the book, to say, let's do something about it. My main argument very clearly is that nothing can happen without a rank and file revival. And I hope that that is what we now see begins to take place over the next couple of years after the excitement and the dangers of the situation that we now find ourselves in. I'll finish there, Sophie. I know people don't like to hear old men going on too much, but I hope that that gives people an idea of what I tried to argue in the book. If people haven't read it, I hope that they get the opportunity to buy it and read it.
Thanks very much, Nigel. That was an excellent introduction. Covered some really interesting topics there. I think plenty of us will have some questions on, hopefully. But as chair, I have the privilege of asking the first couple. So I'll start by asking you a little bit about your background in trade union organising, your international union organising, which you touched on a little bit there, and your victory against Sefton Council in 2005. How did they shape your views and the arguments you make in the book?
Okay, Sophie, so I'll try not to make it like this is your life, but I have had a really, I think, unusual wide experience of trade union work and socialist politics. I was a rank and file activist for nearly 20 years inside Unison. I had a reputation for being a militant activist. I saw no reason why, in terms of fighting our employers, we should not resort to breaking the law and appealing to the rank and file, and often coming into conflict with trade union leadership. That obviously is still the most significant impact on my trade union thinking. And it's not just a question of style, it's a question of instinct, really, of how you feel about what you're confronted with inside the movement. I was eventually sacked for trade union activities, and I was offered a job at Unison as an organizer, and I thought, well, this will be great, because I thought I'll just be carrying on doing more or less what I was doing as a rank and file activist, but working as a really enthusiastic organizer. And within a few years, I have to say, my experience of that was that it's simply impossible to become the enthusiastic organizer that you would like to be when you were an activist. And that's not because people are personally not up to it, or, you know, in some way seduced or are not committed. The way trade unions operate in the absence of rank and file power makes it extremely difficult, even for the most left-wing of leaders and organizers, to follow the path that they might wish to do. Nevertheless, I was involved in some organizing initiatives in the private sector, in the NHS, and in schools, in catering, and in security in the service sector generally. And as a result of that, a global trade union based in Switzerland invited me to come and work on organising projects with security workers and cleaners working in the global south. And it started off as a secondment, but then they asked me to stay, and I was there for 7 years. And there was a wide variety of experiences there in terms of the cultures and the economies that I organised in. And it wasn't what I expected. So I think the common assumption is some of these places would be scruffy little third world, poverty-stricken corners of the earth where trade union organising is just virtually impossible because of a lack of resources. And actually, that's quite rare. Those places do exist, but it is quite rare. And when I worked in cities like Nairobi and in Casablanca, these are huge cities with populations of millions of people, quite modern industries. And actually, it's the same companies that operate in Western Europe. So even though I was organising in Africa, the main companies I was organising against were G4S, massive company in Africa, companies like Teleperformance, the French company, Prosegur, a Spanish multinational security company, Securicor, based all over the world in airports and other kind of important buildings. And so often I was organising with unions that were in very important sectors to the economy in which we were working. But the pressures and the politics were broadly similar to what we face in the UK. The need for a rank and file movement that could exercise its power and operate independently and stick to a task, make leadership accountable to the will and the politics of the members of the union, focus on mobilizing members into the activity and not just small parts of the union, and being prepared to challenge the kind of institutional politics which will always seek to smother, if you like, any kind of rank and file trade union movement. So I worked with trade unions that have been very active in the Arab Spring. I worked with trade unions in Palestine that were very active against the Palestinian Authority. I worked with trade unions in Turkey who were seeking to organize not just against an incredibly oppressive government in terms of trade union activity, with trade union activists constantly being arrested, but also against rival trade unions set up by governments to try and defeat the power of those unions that were successfully organizing. And, you know, in many cases, the sort of problems and the solutions were very, very similar to the problems and the solutions that we face in the UK, except they do have less resources, but also they're much less reliant on, for example, the Labour Party or that whole notion of social democratic politics that in Europe is such a sort of dead hand on so many trade union movements. So it has all impacted, I think, on my experience And I can only come to the conclusion, which is a weird thing, that in a roundabout way, I was probably right the first time, way back when I had hair and was just getting involved with the trade union movement, that the way forward is through rank and file power. And I've seen that all over the world now. And I firmly believe that that is exactly what we need to prioritize and focus on inside the union movement in the UK now.
Thanks. A final question from me then before we open up. As you said, despite the strike wave last year, there's still been a massive decline in trade union membership, I think 200,000. At the June Rank and File conference earlier this year, you spoke about the participation of women and minorities in trade unions. Could you touch on some of the challenges the re-emergence of the working class movement faces and what you think some solutions might be in this respect?
Yeah, and I mean, you know, that conference was a real breath of fresh air, and we want more conferences like that result in action, because that conference is what resulted in calling for the day of solidarity with the Amazon workers on the 5th of August in Coventry, because the Amazon dispute, that represents, better than any other dispute currently taking place in the country, exactly what is going on and what we need to be doing and where we need to be winning inside the union movement more than anything else. Because if you look at the workforce, it's casualized. It's in the click and buy economy. It runs along all kinds of precarious supply chains and delivery operation routes. This is this whole casualized area where the bulk of the workforce are on precarious contracts, and quite often are low-paid young workers. That is where most of the young is. An interesting fact, I just want to say this, during the COVID crisis, 26% of the jobs that were lost during the COVID crisis were jobs that were being done by workers aged 24 and under. You know, so that's the sort of area of the economy that we've virtually disappeared from. So amongst those sort of workforces, it is predominantly in many areas, the care sector is a classic one, very low paid young women workers. And in that 200,000 reduction or collapse in trade union membership in 2022, a 200,000 members drop in the number of union members in the trade union movement. 129,000 of those, approximately, were women who worked in the private sector. So when we're looking at the areas in which unions can or are finding it most difficult to organise and grow in, they are also the areas where the workforce are most likely to be young workers, young women workers, or young black and brown workers, or immigrant workers, or casualised workers. That's where we're not winning. And that sector of the economy is growing every year. The sector of the economies that we do okay in, they're the ones that are shrinking. But even in the ones where we think we're doing okay, our membership actually is still pretty low. Unison should be, you know, Unison could have been at the heart of trade union revival. It does recruit probably better than most of the other trade unions, but it also loses a significant number of members every month at the same time that it's recruiting people. And the sectors in which they could be organising, like the care sector, like the NHS, they're failing to do so. They are still a minority trade union. So I know that sounds all doom and gloom, and I do believe that there's a way out of this, but it has to be a way out that's based on rank.